Barry Minkow was not the kind of pastor people expected to become one of the most notorious fraudsters in American religious history. He was charismatic, sharp, and persuasive, qualities that made him both beloved and feared in equal measure. To his congregation, he was a visionary. To federal investigators, he was a two-time felon hiding behind scripture. To those who trusted him most, he was the pastor who turned blessings into betrayal and faith into financial ruin. Born and raised in California, Barry's introduction to crime began long before he ever stood behind a pulpit. As a teenager, he built a carpet-cleaning business that turned into one of the most infamous Ponzi schemes of the 1980s. His company looked legitimate: flashy ads, high-profile investors, and skyrocketing profits. But it was nothing more than layers of lies. When it collapsed, Barry was exposed, tried, and sentenced to prison. He was young, disgraced, but still disturbingly gifted at the art of deception. During his time in prison, he underwent what he claimed was a spiritual transformation. He said God had changed him. He said he was a new man, and for a while, people believed him. When he was released, he began speaking at churches, warning young people about the dangers of dishonesty and greed. He was articulate, emotional, and convincing. Churches welcomed him. Schools hired him as a motivational speaker. He was seen as a redemption story, proof that even the worst sinner could become a testimony. Eventually, Barry became a pastor. He took leadership over the San Diego Community Bible Church, and almost instantly, attendance grew. People loved hearing him preach about second chances. He was raw, honest, and persuasive. He spoke openly about his past crimes, using them as cautionary tales. He built programs for addiction recovery, family counseling, and financial stewardship. He told people they could overcome anything with God's help. But behind the sermons and the applause, a darker truth was forming. Barry hadn't changed. He had only become better at hiding. Once again, he began manipulating the people who trusted him. Members viewed him as a shepherd, someone who had walked through the fire and come out purified. But Barry used their admiration to rebuild the only kind of empire he ever knew how to run, one built on fraud. His new scheme didn't begin with investors, it began with church members. Many congregants were elderly. Many were vulnerable. Many viewed Barry as not only their pastor, but also a financial mentor. He offered advice freely. He claimed he had unique insight from his past, and when he recommended certain investments, people listened. They trusted him. Barry began soliciting money quietly. At first, it looked harmless: small financial opportunities, quick suggestions, promises of modest returns. He framed it all as a way for church members to grow their inheritance or honor God with stewardship. But he wasn't investing their money. He was stealing it. One member lost $30,000. Another lost $50,000. An elderly couple had come to Barry for prayer during a cancer diagnosis, lost nearly $100,000 that they had saved for medical care. Barry's fraud grew in complexity. He manipulated loan documents, forged signatures, and exploited charitable pledges. He stole directly from his own congregation's pockets while preaching about honesty and integrity every Sunday morning. And he didn't stop there. Barry also became a public figure in the world of corporate fraud investigation. He built a reputation as an expert who could expose scams. Companies hired him to uncover corruption. Media outlets invited him to speak on financial crime. He positioned himself as a champion of truth, a reformed felon devoted to justice. But behind the scenes, he was using his expert reputation to commit even more fraud. He wrote false reports claiming that certain companies were corrupt. When stock prices dropped as a result, he profited. He didn't care if businesses collapsed or if employees lost their jobs. He cared only about money. The manipulation deepened when he started involving his church in the schemes. Members signed forms they didn't understand, believing they were helping the ministry. Barry used church funds to support his operations. He used congregants' identities for credit applications. He blended the sacred with the criminal so seamlessly that for years, no one questioned him. The turning point came when a church member, a widowed woman in her 70s, reported suspicious withdrawals from her account. She trusted Barry completely. He had counseled her after her husband's death. He had prayed in her home. He had assured her that God would guide her financial decisions through him. When investigators traced the missing money, Barry's name appeared everywhere. Authorities dug deeper and realized the scale of the fraud was far larger than expected. Multiple church members had been exploited. Barry had forged documents, manipulated charitable donations, and fabricated business opportunities. What he had done wasn't a mistake or an oversight, it was a deliberate abuse of pastoral authority. Federal agents arrested Barry again. The congregation was devastated. Many cried, some refused to believe it. They had watched him baptize children, marry couples, and bury loved ones. They couldn't imagine that the man who preached forgiveness and healing was the same man who had taken their savings, their trust, and their faith in goodness. During the investigation, agents uncovered more than $3 million in fraudulent schemes tied directly to Barry's activities as a pastor. He had deceived his board, falsified church documents, and used prayer meetings as opportunities to scout vulnerable targets. Members who once called him a spiritual father now realized they had been manipulated by a man who had simply found a new stage for an old pattern. At trial, Barry tried to claim he had relapsed into old habits, but had never intended harm. He talked about childhood trauma, stress, and spiritual warfare, but the evidence was overwhelming. His actions were calculated, repeated, and driven by greed. The judge sentenced him to additional years in federal prison. He was taken away while former congregants watched from the gallery, some angry, some grieving, all betrayed. In the aftermath, the church struggled to survive. Attendance dropped dramatically. Donations fell. Many members left religion entirely. They couldn't reconcile how a man they trusted with their souls could steal their futures. A new pastor eventually took over, but healing was slow. Emotional wounds ran deep. Members sat in pews that reminded them of the prayers they once whispered in trust. Prayers the man leading them had twisted for money. Several victims never recovered financially. One woman lost her home. The elderly couple never regained their medical savings. The widow who first raised concerns lived the rest of her life fearful of trusting anyone again. Barry Minkow eventually tried to present himself once more as a changed man. He gave interviews. He wrote apologies. He claimed God had finally humbled him, but many of his victims felt his words were just another performance, one last attempt to control the narrative. The haunting truth of his case lingers in every church member he deceived. A pastor isn't automatically a protector. A pulpit isn't automatically a place of truth. And a redeemed reputation can hide the darkest intentions. Faith communities often assume those who fall once will rise reborn. Barry weaponized that belief. He used forgiveness as a shield, and trust as currency. He preached about blessings while robbing people who would have given him anything simply because they believed he was a changed man. His story forces a painful question. How do you protect yourself when the person who betrays you uses God's name to do it? And for the victims of Barry Minkow, the answer is something they still struggle with today, because betrayal from a stranger hurts, but betrayal from a pastor can ruin a soul. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. The story of Jim Bakker is one of the most infamous examples of a preacher who promised divine blessings but delivered betrayal, manipulation, and financial devastation to thousands who trusted him. It begins in an era when American televangelism was exploding across television screens, reshaping the meaning of ministry, wealth, and faith. To many, he was a warm, smiling voice of comfort. To others, he would later become the face of unchecked greed, corruption, and moral collapse. His rise was unlike anything that had been seen before. Together with his then-wife, Tammy Faye Bakker, he built a media empire that stretched across television networks, merchandise, theme parks, and massive fundraising operations that operated on a simple promise: give generously, and God would give back greater blessings. For millions of viewers, this message felt empowering, hopeful, and spiritually affirming. But behind the cameras, behind the smiling hosts, a different machine was running, one built not on faith, but on financial desperation, mismanagement, and deliberate manipulation of the very donors whose trust sustained their empire. Years before the scandal that would rock the ministry, Jim and Tammy Bakker had risen from small-town Christian entertainers to global religious celebrities. Their program, the PTL Club, felt like a blend of worship service, talk show, and telethon. Congregants would tune in live, experiencing a sense of community from across the country. For the lonely, the sick, the elderly, and the spiritually uncertain, the Bakkers seemed to offer something irreplaceable, a connection to God, wrapped in warmth and familiarity. But as the ministry grew, so did its appetite for money. Donations were no longer simply welcomed. They became essential. Fundraising took center stage, and Jim Bakker began developing new ways to extract more money from his viewers, while making them believe their generosity would directly influence their personal blessings, future prosperity, and spiritual standing. One of his most successful strategies was the Lifetime Partnership Program. For a hefty contribution, donors were promised access to luxury vacation suites at the PTL Retreat Center, a Christian getaway built to symbolize faith-driven prosperity. Viewers sent in checks by the tens of thousands, believing they were investing in a holy mission rather than a business scheme. But behind the scenes, the staff at PTL Ministry already knew the truth. Bakker had sold far more partnerships than the retreat could ever fulfill. It was a financial impossibility disguised as a divine opportunity. The ministry was drowning in overspending, and yet the fundraising pleas never slowed. Instead, they intensified, framed as holy battles against unseen forces trying to stop God's work. When auditors raised concerns, they were ignored. When staff members questioned the ethics, they were pushed aside. And when donors wrote letters asking why they couldn't book the suites they'd been promised, they received carefully worded excuses meant to delay suspicion. For years, the illusion held, but the downfall came not through finances at first. Instead, it began with a personal scandal. A young church secretary named Jessica Hahn came forward, revealing she had been sexually assaulted by Bakker and another pastor years earlier. Even more damning, she revealed that PTL ministry funds had been used to buy her silence. That revelation cracked the image Bakker had built. Suddenly, the smiling, soft-spoken pastor on millions of screens was seen in a very different light. As the story spread, journalists began digging deeper. A full investigation unearthed years of financial misconduct, including intentional overselling of the Lifetime Partnership suites, falsified accounting, and the misuse of ministry funds for personal luxury private homes, lavish wardrobes, expensive cars, and extravagant gifts. The numbers weren't small. They weren't accidental. They were systemic, deliberate, and sustained. Federal investigators stepped in. Donors who had believed their contributions went toward God's work now found themselves listed as victims in a massive fraud case. Many of them were elderly, living on limited incomes, who had sent in checks month after month because Bakker promised that giving to God would open doors in heaven, and sometimes, he hinted, even on earth. For them, the betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. It was spiritual, emotional, and deeply personal. The trial that followed brought national attention. Jim Bakker faced dozens of counts of fraud, conspiracy, and mail violations. In the courtroom, his empire was dismantled piece by piece. Prosecutors presented evidence showing how donor contributions had been diverted into personal accounts, how financial statements were manipulated to hide losses, and how the partnership programs were mathematically impossible from the moment they were created. In 1989, Bakker was convicted and sentenced to prison. The sentence was severe, reflecting the scale and intentional nature of the fraud. Supporters sobbed in the courtroom as the judge spoke, while critics argued the punishment still didn't match the damage he had caused. His wife, Tammy Faye, publicly defended him for months, but the couple eventually separated. The ministry they had built collapsed completely, leaving behind unpaid bills, devastated followers, and a legacy of scandal that reshaped public perception of televangelism. But even after the conviction, the impact of Bakker's betrayal continued, spiraling outward. Many former donors reported long-term distrust in religious institutions, feeling they could no longer tell the difference between faith leaders and con artists. Others felt profound guilt, believing they had been foolish, or that their vulnerability had made them easy targets. For some families, the financial strain caused by their donations triggered years of hardship. Communities around the country began asking deeper questions about accountability in religious organizations. How much oversight should ministries have? How should churches handle donations? And most painfully, how can ordinary believers protect themselves from leaders who hide greed behind scripture? After serving several years in prison, Bakker eventually returned to televangelism, though never with the same influence. Critics argued that his comeback demonstrated how easy it is for charismatic religious figures to regain a following. Even after public disgrace, supporters insisted he had paid his debt and deserved a second chance. But no matter where people stood, one truth remained. The wounds left by his ministry were still felt by those who had believed in him the most. The story of Jim Bakker forces viewers to confront an uncomfortable question. How does faith turn into a weapon in the hands of someone who knows how to manipulate hope, guilt, and the desire for divine certainty? For many of his former followers, the hardest part wasn't losing money, it was losing trust. Trust in a leader, trust in their own judgment, and sometimes even trust in the faith they once held dear. And that is the haunting legacy of a preacher who promised blessings but delivered betrayal. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. The case of Anthony Hopkins is one of the darkest and most unsettling examples of a preacher who shattered every boundary of trust, morality, and humanity. This story isn't about financial betrayal or manipulation from a distance. It is about a man who stood in the pulpit, preaching purity, righteousness, and spiritual healing while hiding crimes, so terrifying that even prosecutors struggled to comprehend the full reality of what he had done. To understand how such a figure rose to a place of spiritual authority, we must go back to the quiet, rural communities of southern Alabama, where churches aren't just buildings, they are social centers, anchors of tradition, and places where families gather generation after generation. In these towns, a pastor is more than a spiritual leader. He is a guide, a moral compass, someone entrusted with the deepest burdens of his congregation. For many, their pastor is the person they call when they are sick, grieving, lost, or desperate for reassurance. That was the role Anthony Hopkins stepped into. He presented himself as a devout Christian leader, a man who claimed to have been called by God to guide others. His sermons touched on suffering, redemption, and spiritual protection from evil. Families sat in crowded pews listening to his soft-spoken voice, believing this man was blessed with divine purpose. And in the conservative communities where he preached, his confidence, his certainty, and his moral posturing were powerful tools. People trusted him because his position demanded trust. They believed him because he carried a Bible, spoke in scriptural language, and lived among them as though he truly embodied the faith he taught. But behind the walls of his home, behind the gentle persona, the pastoral authority, and the public image of a holy man, Anthony Hopkins controlled his household with fear, manipulation, violence, and psychological domination. What investigators would later uncover seemed impossible to connect to the man who stood at the pulpit. But when the truth surfaced, it shocked not only the congregation, not only the town, but the entire country. The first cracks in his facade appeared in the form of a teenage daughter, one who had spent years suffering silently under his control. On the outside, she looked like any other girl growing up in a religious household, attending church, participating in community gatherings, staying close to home under the oversight of strict parents. Inside, she was carrying secrets she didn't yet have the language or the freedom to reveal. That changed the night she fled to a local women's shelter. Trembling, terrified, and unsure of what would happen next, she began to tell counselors what her life had really been like inside Anthony Hopkins' home. At first, the staff thought she had to be exaggerating. The claims were too extreme, too bizarre, too horrifying to fully believe. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became. This was not a confused teenager. This was a traumatized survivor finally escaping a nightmare. She told them she had endured years of sexual abuse. She described being isolated from the outside world. And then she told them something even more chilling, something the counselors immediately reported to authorities. She said her father had murdered her mother. Not only that, he had forced his children to help conceal the crime. According to her account, the mother, a woman who had been missing for years, had not left voluntarily, as Hopkins had claimed. Instead, she had been killed inside their home, and the body had been hidden in a freezer. Her words were detailed, consistent, and delivered with the kind of trembling precision that only comes from someone recounting trauma they have tried to escape for years. Authorities acted immediately. Armed with a search warrant and prepared for the worst, they entered the Hopkins home, a home that had been presented to the world as a place of faith, music, prayer, and spiritual authority. What they found confirmed the daughter's story in the most horrifying way possible. Inside a large freezer, behind household items and wrapped materials, was the frozen body of a woman. It had been there for years, preserved, concealed, and hidden in the very place Hopkins had raised his children, preached from his kitchen table, and called himself a devoted servant of God. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Congregants who once shook Hopkins' hand, who listened to his sermons, who confided in him, now found themselves questioning every memory, every interaction, every moment they had trusted him. Local news crews rushed to the scene. Neighbors gathered outside the home in disbelief, and detectives began the slow, painful process of unraveling a crime that blended domestic terror with religious manipulation in a way almost too disturbing to articulate. When officers confronted Hopkins, they didn't find a remorseful man broken by guilt. They found a preacher still trying to control the narrative. He denied wrongdoing. He insisted the accusations were false. He acted as though the truth could be prayed away or dismissed through biblical justification. Even when confronted with physical evidence, he attempted to position himself as a misunderstood man under spiritual attack. But the evidence was overwhelming. The autopsy results confirmed homicide. Interviews with multiple children revealed years of abuse, threats, and psychological conditioning. They described a household ruled by fear, where disobedience meant punishment and questioning their father's authority was unimaginable. He told them God was on his side, that he alone interpreted scripture correctly, and that their survival depended on obeying him absolutely. It wasn't just manipulation, it was indoctrination. The trial became a harrowing window into a world hidden behind a pastor's smile. Prosecutors presented not just forensic evidence, but testimony from children who had survived years of trauma. They described how Hopkins used religion as both shield and weapon. He would quote scripture while committing atrocities. He framed his abuse as God's plan. He convinced his victims that exposing him would bring divine wrath upon them, and through fear, he kept them silent long enough to cover his tracks. But once the truth was spoken in a courtroom, spoken clearly, bravely, and without the filter of fear, there was no room left for doubt. The jury convicted Anthony Hopkins on charges of murder, rape, incest, abuse, and the concealment of a corpse. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. The community he once led turned away in collective horror. The church where he preached distanced itself completely, issuing statements, condemning his actions, and expressing sympathy for the victims. Yet no apology could undo the years of damage he caused. In the aftermath, the children who survived began the long process of healing, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Many required therapy for years. Some struggled with identity, trust, and memory. Others found themselves wrestling with their faith, unsure how to reconcile the idea of a loving God with the actions of a man who claimed to represent him. Their journey continues, shaped by resilience, support networks, and the courage they found in speaking the truth. The community, too, had to rebuild. It had to confront the uncomfortable reality that evil can hide behind a pulpit, that a kind smile can mask monstrous intentions, and that blind trust, even in religious authority, can become a dangerous vulnerability. The case sparked conversations about oversight within churches, the need for accountability, and the importance of safe reporting structures that protect vulnerable individuals from those who wield spiritual power as a weapon. The haunting takeaway from this story is not only the brutality of one man's crimes, but the terrifying ease with which he concealed them beneath the cloak of religious authority. It forces us to ask a question that echoes far beyond the courtroom. How many people assume safety in a pastor's presence simply because he carries a Bible? And how many crimes remain hidden because victims are too afraid to accuse someone the community sees as holy? For those who followed Anthony Hopkins, the betrayal was complete, spiritual, emotional, familial, and human, and the scars left behind serve as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who convinces the world he is a shepherd. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. They didn't just betray their faith, they hunted the people who trusted them. These are the preachers who used the pulpit as a weapon. Millions trusted them as spiritual leaders, but behind closed doors, they were hiding crimes darker than anyone imagined. Tonight, we expose pastors who used faith as their greatest weapon. Pastor Elijah Warren didn't look like a con man. He looked like hope. Tall, thin, soft-spoken, always smiling gently. Elijah carried the kind of presence people described as comforting and warm. He founded a small church in rural Georgia in the late 1990s, preaching about renewal, divine turnaround, and blessings waiting just over the horizon. His sermons were emotional, filled with stories of people who had been healed, delivered, or financially transformed because they had sown into God's promise. But behind the pulpit, behind the scripture, behind the soft-spoken encouragement, Elijah wasn't promising miracles. He was selling them, and people were buying. His ministry grew quickly, not because of its size, but because of its intensity. Members said it felt like a place where impossible things could suddenly happen. Elijah had a gift for telling stories of miracles he claimed to have witnessed. A young woman cured of cancer, a man whose business turned around overnight, a mother reunited with her runaway son, a couple conceiving after years of infertility. Every story ended the same way. It started with a seed. He would pause, lower his voice, and say, "You can't receive a blessing unless you plant one." And people would nod. Some would cry. Some would reach into purses and wallets on the spot. Elijah insisted that seed offerings had to be sacrificial, something that costs you enough to get God's attention. He said small offerings were fine, but big miracles require big faith. He told people their blessings were waiting, but God needed to see their commitment first. Slowly, quietly, the offerings became mandatory. A woman battling depression was told she could only receive deliverance sessions if she sowed a breakthrough seed. A man battling unemployment was told a business blessing required a prosperity seed. Families struggling to pay bills were told their financial turnaround wouldn't come until they sowed a restoration seed. And if someone didn't have money, Elijah told them to stretch their faith. Some maxed out credit cards, some borrowed money, some refinanced cars. A few even took out personal loans. Elijah didn't force them, he just convinced them that God would repay anything they gave. Behind his calm voice was a dangerously persuasive belief. If they didn't give, they were blocking their own blessings. The fraud didn't start big. It started with envelope small, unrecorded offerings that Elijah kept separate from the church finances. He called them prophetic envelopes. The board trusted him. He was the pastor, after all. Who were they to question how spiritual gifts worked? But as Elijah's confidence grew, so did the scheme. He started promising miracle return cycles where God would return twice, 5 times, or even 10 times the amount given. He backed it with scripture, weaving biblical stories into financial manipulation until his people couldn't separate faith from pressure. And then came the promise sheets. Elijah began issuing handwritten cards with phrases like, "Your blessing will arrive in 40 days. Your healing is already written. A double portion is coming. Expect supernatural checks." People taped these cards to their fridges, their mirrors, their walls. They believed in them, they prayed over them, but nothing came. And Elijah blamed the people, not the promises. If your blessing hasn't manifested, it means you haven't sown enough, or you've doubted, or you're allowing the enemy to block your increase. People tried harder, gave more, prayed more, cried more. Some questioned him, gently, fearfully. Elijah always answered the same way. You can't rush God, but you can show him your faith. The church secretary, Marlene, was the first person to suspect something was wrong. She noticed irregularities not in the church accounts, but in what Elijah kept hidden. His personal lifestyle began to shift quietly. He bought a new truck, then a second vehicle. His clothes became more expensive, his vacations more frequent. He told the church God was blessing him for his faith. But Marlene saw the truth. God wasn't blessing him. People were. Still, she stayed silent. He was trusted, beloved, revered. That changed when she overheard a conversation between Elijah and an older member named Harold. Harold had been struggling financially after his wife's medical bills piled up. He had given nearly everything he had, nearly $12,000 in 1 year alone, because Elijah told him a healing miracle was coming. Now Harold was facing foreclosure. He begged Elijah to pray with him. Elijah did, but only after insisting Harold give one more seed offering, a final act of faith. Harold apologized for not having more. Elijah told him God understood, but a miracle couldn't come without faith. After Harold left, Elijah smiled to himself, and Marlene broke inside. She went home and cried. Then she made a decision that changed everything. She contacted state investigators. The investigation began quietly. Officials reviewed financial statements. They traced the path of prophetic envelopes. They interviewed congregants who had given thousands of dollars but seen no return. They gathered stories of personal debt, broken promises, and emotional coercion. It wasn't simple charity. It wasn't voluntary giving. It was spiritual fraud using religious authority to manipulate vulnerable people into financial contributions based on false promises. Investigators discovered Elijah collected nearly $400,000 over a 5-year period in unreported seed offerings. None of it went to the church. It went to his personal accounts, personal trips, personal expenses. He was arrested during a Sunday morning service. The congregation watched in shock as officers entered the sanctuary and walked straight to the pulpit. Elijah tried to maintain calm. He lifted his hands as if in surrender, muttering that he was being persecuted for righteousness. But the charges were serious: fraud, financial exploitation, and theft by deception. As news spread, his congregation split into two groups. Some defended him fiercely, claiming the government was targeting a man of God. Others finally saw the manipulation that had controlled them for years, and the aftermath was devastating. Several families lost homes. A woman went into bankruptcy. An elderly couple postponed retirement indefinitely. A young man said he no longer believed in God because the only preacher he ever trusted had lied. Harold, the man who had begged Elijah for help, died of heart failure before the trial concluded. The foreclosure went through, and he spent his final weeks in a cramped apartment, wondering why God never delivered the blessing Elijah promised. When Elijah faced the court, he still refused responsibility. He blamed spiritual warfare, claiming Satan was attacking his ministry. But the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted and sentenced to 9 years in prison. Today, the church building stands empty most days. A new pastor occasionally holds small gatherings, but the congregation never recovered. Too many hearts had been shattered. Too many lives uprooted. The haunting question remains: how many people gave their last dollars not to God, not to faith, but to a man who knew exactly how to sell hope as a product? And for every Elijah exposed, how many others continue promising blessings they know they can never deliver? What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. The story of Gerald O is the story of a man who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most influential preachers in his state, a spiritual authority whose booming voice filled sanctuaries and overflow rooms. A pastor who promised divine blessings, financial breakthroughs, and miraculous healing to anyone willing to believe hard enough. He presented himself as a man chosen by God, blessed with prophetic vision, and called to lead thousands into a deeper faith. But behind the scenes, behind the pulpit lights and televised sermons, Pastor Glenn operated a hidden system of manipulation, financial coercion, and psychological pressure that drained the pockets of his flock while enriching his own life in ways that contradicted every biblical principle he claimed to defend. To understand how he gained such power, you must first understand the environment he preached in. He led a charismatic, high-energy megachurch located in the heart of Virginia, a church that grew from a small, rented room to a sprawling complex visited by local politicians, law enforcement officials, business owners, and vulnerable families seeking help. His ministry attracted people from every walk of life: single mothers looking for hope, retirees craving connection, unemployed men searching for purpose, and wealthy professionals drawn by his bold, confident preaching. His sermons were electrifying. He moved across the stage with intensity, shouting revelations, quoting scripture with theatrical pacing, and promising that God would pour blessings upon those who trusted him enough to give. He preached about abundance, prosperity, and divine multiplication. What he didn't preach was restraint. He rarely talked about stewardship. He never warned about financial exploitation, because exploitation was the very foundation of his hidden enterprise. He used a simple but powerful tactic. He made people believe that giving money to him was the same as giving money to God. And when members questioned the church's financial transparency, he framed their doubts as spiritual weakness, an attack of the devil trying to steal their blessings. Over time, he refined his methods, using a mixture of intimidation, religious fear, and social pressure. He told his followers that God expected them to sacrifice. He claimed that tithing was not optional, but required for salvation. He insisted that offerings should be given above and beyond, even if members were struggling to pay bills. He taught that debt could be broken by giving more, and the more people gave, the more he pressured them to continue. Some congregants worked 2 or 3 jobs just to keep up with their weekly faith pledges. Some maxed out credit cards, others took out loans, and Pastor Glenn never discouraged them. Instead, he encouraged more, promising that their seed would return 1,000-fold, a claim he delivered with such authority that even skeptical members found themselves wondering whether he truly had a divine hotline that the rest of them couldn't hear. The turning point came when a series of anonymous letters reached the local newspaper. The letters accused the pastor of financial fraud, misuse of donations, and exploiting church funds for personal luxury. At first, reporters were hesitant. Megachurches shield themselves well, and clergy misconduct is notoriously difficult to pierce. But the letters kept coming, and eventually a journalist decided to investigate. She found former church members who had left quietly, afraid of retaliation or public shaming. One described being told that God would curse her family if she stopped giving. Another said she was instructed to hand over her tax refund check as a show of surrender. One man even said the pastor convinced him to sell his car and donate the money, telling him that God would return it 10 times over, a promise that never materialized. But these were just testimonies. Allegations alone weren't enough. The journalist needed evidence. That evidence surfaced in the form of a whistleblower, a former church accountant who had worked inside the financial office for over a decade. He provided documents showing expenditures that made no sense for a religious institution: personal vacations disguised as mission trips, luxury vehicles listed as ministry equipment, and large cash withdrawals with no documented purpose. Even more troubling were reports submitted to the IRS showing underreported income, a discrepancy the accountant said had been intentionally manipulated to conceal the pastor's lavish lifestyle. Still, the pastor seemed untouchable. His charisma was so powerful that members defended him aggressively. They called the allegations lies. They claimed the media was targeting a successful black pastor. They insisted the church was under spiritual attack, and when reporters tried to confront him directly, he refused interviews, instead preaching fiery sermons about persecution and warfare. Then the pandemic arrived, and this is when everything collapsed. Despite statewide restrictions, Pastor Glenn publicly declared that no virus would close his church. He encouraged hundreds to continue attending services in person, dismissing health warnings as fear tactics. He claimed that God would protect the faithful, saying, "I firmly believe the Lord will shield us from this disease." His refusal to close the church drew criticism, but many of his followers applauded his courage. They believed his spiritual authority would protect them, even as hospitalizations rose around the state. Then several congregants became sick, quietly at first, but soon in noticeable numbers. Within weeks, more than a dozen members of the church contracted the virus. Several were hospitalized, and then, in a shocking twist, the pastor himself fell gravely ill. For the first time in years, the lights on the pulpit dimmed. He could no longer preach. His voice, once thunderous, faded into silence, and the congregation began to panic. Some blamed the government, others blamed the media, but a growing number began whispering a question none had dared speak aloud before. Had he lied to them? Had he placed them at risk for his own ego, his own desire for control, his own unwillingness to lose the weekly tithes that kept his empire alive? The truth became unavoidable when Pastor Glenn was admitted to the hospital in critical condition, and the truth became devastating when he died shortly after. His death shocked the congregation, but it also triggered an avalanche of scrutiny. Scrutiny his ministry had escaped for years. With his leadership gone, the financial structure he built began to unravel. The accountant came forward again. Former members spoke openly. Investigators launched a formal review into the church's financial dealings. The resulting audit revealed years of It showed that church money had funded vacations, luxury items, private properties, and thousands of dollars in unexplained cash flow. It showed that he had been living a double life, a public life of holiness and a private life of indulgence. Worse still, it showed how much his followers had suffered while he prospered. Families who could barely afford groceries had given more than 10% of their income every month. Members had skipped medical care to keep up with tithing. Elderly congregants living off Social Security had donated nearly everything they had, believing their suffering would soon be replaced with divine miracles. There were no miracles. There was only betrayal. In the aftermath, the church fractured. Some members left permanently, disillusioned and ashamed. Others stayed, trying to heal. Lawsuits were filed. Trustees resigned. Internal conflicts erupted as leaders debated how to repair the church's reputation. But beneath the legal chaos, there was a deeply human story, one of manipulation and vulnerability, of people seeking hope and finding a wolf in shepherd's clothing. Pastor Glenn didn't commit murder. He didn't commit physical violence, but he broke something profound and sacred. He exploited the trust of people desperate for spiritual guidance. He made them believe that giving money to him was giving money to God, and when he died, the truth left a stain that no sermon, no apology, no prayer could wash away. In the end, the haunting takeaway from his story is this: spiritual authority can become a weapon when placed in the hands of someone who understands how to use faith as leverage. His congregation believed he spoke for God, They believed he saw visions of their future. They believed he could command blessings with a prayer, and he used that belief not to lead them, but to drain them. This is the legacy of Pastor Gerald O, a man who promised blessings, but delivered betrayal wrapped in scripture, manipulation disguised as prophecy, and financial exploitation hidden behind a pulpit. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. The story of Robert Tilton is one of the most infamous examples of a preacher who used the language of faith to manipulate millions of followers, promising blessings and divine intervention while concealing an elaborate system of deceit that would eventually shock the nation. Tilton's rise was meteoric, fueled by television, charisma, and a promise that anyone who gave generously would receive God's favor in return. He preached hope, healing, and prosperity, and for a time, millions believed he was a direct conduit to God's miracles. But beneath the televised smiles, the polished sets, and the powerful sermons, Tilton's empire was built on exploitation, deception, and betrayal. Robert Tilton was born in Texas, in a region where religion was woven deeply into daily life. From an early age, he displayed a knack for persuasion, a way with words, and a natural ability to command attention. As a young man, he began preaching in small, local churches, gradually building a reputation for energetic, emotional sermons. He had a unique ability to connect with his audience, to make individuals feel as though he spoke directly to them. By the late 1970s, he was hosting revival meetings, and by the early 1980s, he had transitioned to television. The medium amplified his reach exponentially, allowing him to speak not just to thousands, but to millions across the United States. Tilton's televised ministry emphasized what he called seed faith. Viewers were told that by sending donations, no matter the size, they were planting seeds that God would multiply into tangible blessings, financial, personal, or spiritual. The language was simple, yet powerful. Sow a seed, and watch God's favor unfold. He assured his followers that there were no limits to what God could provide, but faith required action. In practice, this meant that sending money to Tilton's ministry was framed as both a religious obligation and a spiritual opportunity. Initially, the strategy appeared effective. Donations poured in. Tilton's broadcasts became daily staples for viewers seeking miracles. Stories of divine healing and prosperity were presented on air, creating an emotional connection with the audience. People believed their offerings were enabling them to receive blessings in return. The psychology was simple but persuasive. The more you give, the more God rewards you, and Tilton's charisma made it impossible for many to question him. Behind the camera, however, the situation was drastically different. While the ministry claimed that contributions were used for charitable and spiritual purposes, the reality was that a significant portion of funds was diverted for personal use. Tilton lived in luxury, purchasing expensive homes, lavish cars, and high-end clothing, all funded by the donations of viewers who trusted him to steward their money responsibly. The ministry's accounting practices were deliberately opaque, ensuring that few could trace exactly where the money went. Critics who attempted to scrutinize the organization were often met with hostility, accusations of disbelief, or claims that they were attacking God's servant. By the late 1980s, Tilton's empire had grown into a multi-million-dollar operation. He had staff managing correspondence, officers processing donations, and a network of television affiliates airing his programs. The seed faith model encouraged repeat giving, creating a continuous flow of funds. Viewers were inundated with direct mail requests, phone solicitations, and televised appeals that framed donation as a spiritual imperative. The language of urgency, "God is calling you to act now," was pervasive, leaving individuals feeling both inspired and pressured to comply. For many, the effects were devastating. Ordinary people gave beyond their means, incurring debt or depleting savings to comply with what they believed was a divine mandate. Elderly individuals, trusting in Tilton's promises of miraculous provision, often contributed life savings or retirement funds. Families struggling financially were convinced that obedience would bring relief, yet the promised blessings rarely materialized. Instead, the cycle of giving continued, fueled by guilt, hope, and a desire to demonstrate unwavering faith. The tipping point came in the early 1990s when investigative journalists began exposing discrepancies between Tilton's public claims and the reality of his ministry's finances. Reports highlighted the contrast between the ministry's lavish spending and the hardships faced by donors. Hidden cameras and insider testimony revealed shocking practices, including selective acknowledgement of donations, misleading correspondence designed to elicit additional contributions, and the diversion of charitable funds to support Tilton's personal lifestyle. Investigators concluded that millions of dollars had been mishandled over the years. In 1991, Tilton's operations became the focus of a national television investigation. The expos presented evidence of financial mismanagement, deceptive solicitation practices, and the use of personal gain as the driving force behind a ministry that had promised divine blessing. The program featured interviews with former staff, disillusioned donors, and religious scholars, painting a portrait of a charismatic preacher who had weaponized faith for profit. For many viewers, the revelation was shocking. The pastor they had trusted, the man who had promised healing and prosperity in exchange for devotion, had misused their faith to enrich himself. The fallout was immediate and widespread. Regulatory authorities initiated inquiries into the ministry's financial practices. Civil lawsuits were filed by donors seeking restitution. The public discourse around Tilton's case catalyzed broader scrutiny of televangelist operations, highlighting the vulnerabilities of viewers who were both spiritually devoted and financially trusting. Many of Tilton's followers experienced profound emotional distress, grappling with betrayal on both spiritual and personal levels. The sense of being deceived by a trusted religious figure left lasting psychological scars, with some reporting difficulty reconciling their faith with the reality of what had occurred. Despite the intense public scrutiny and legal challenges, Tilton did not immediately face criminal convictions. Regulatory penalties and fines were imposed, but he retained a degree of influence, continuing to broadcast to a reduced but loyal audience. The case highlighted a critical issue in religious oversight: the complex balance between freedom of worship and accountability. While Tilton's ministry had engaged in deceptive practices, prosecuting spiritual leaders presented challenges related to First Amendment protections, jurisdictional limitations, and evidentiary standards. This legal complexity allowed him to continue operating, even as his public reputation was irreversibly damaged. The psychological mechanisms Tilton employed were both sophisticated and deeply manipulative. He framed giving as a test of faith, reinforced by anecdotal success stories, emotional appeals, and promises of immediate or future reward. The concept of seed faith created a virtuous cycle of hope, guilt, and reinforcement that kept donors contributing over extended periods. For many, questioning or refusing to participate became a spiritual dilemma. To resist giving was to resist God. This blending of religious doctrine with psychological pressure represents a chilling example of how spiritual authority can be used to exploit trust on a mass scale. By the mid-1990s, Tilton's public profile had diminished, but the legacy of his actions persisted. Donors who had lost significant sums faced financial hardship, in some cases losing homes, retirement funds, or savings accumulated over a lifetime. Families who had invested in the promise of divine return experienced emotional devastation, disillusionment with organized religion, and mistrust of spiritual leadership. The case became a cautionary tale, frequently cited in discussions of religious fraud, financial exploitation, and the ethical responsibilities of clergy who operate with public influence. The haunting question left in the wake of Robert Tilton's actions is this: how do communities protect themselves when a leader who commands spiritual authority chooses personal gain over genuine service? How do followers reconcile their faith when the person entrusted with guidance, blessings, and hope has weaponized that trust for profit? Tilton's story is not simply about money, it is about the profound betrayal of confidence, belief, and spiritual expectation. For decades, religious scholars, journalists, and psychologists have analyzed the mechanisms behind Tilton's rise and fall. The consensus is clear: charisma alone is insufficient to explain the scale of deception. It was the combination of public trust, emotional influence, and lack of transparency that enabled one man to manipulate millions under the guise of spiritual authority. The victims were not just those who lost money. They were people who had invested their hope, their faith, and their trust in a man who ultimately placed his self-interest above all else. Today, Tilton's case is studied as a landmark example of televangelist fraud and the ethical pitfalls inherent in ministries operating with minimal oversight. While he eventually faced regulatory consequences, the human cost remains unquantifiable. Lives were altered, trust in religious institutions was eroded, and communities were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that even those who preach the most inspiring messages can hide betrayal behind smiles, scripture, and the promise of divine favor. The legacy of Robert Tilton endures as a cautionary tale for anyone who places blind trust in religious authority. He promised blessings, he sold hope, and for countless individuals, he delivered only betrayal, a lesson in vigilance, discernment, and the fragile boundaries between faith and exploitation. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. The story of Eddie Long is one of the most disturbing accounts of a religious leader who exploited the very people he promised to protect and guide. Known for his charismatic preaching, motivational messages, and larger-than-life presence, Eddie Long built one of the most influential megachurches in Atlanta, Georgia. For years, the New Birth Missionary Baptist Church attracted thousands of members, growing into a sprawling spiritual empire with television broadcasts, public appearances, and social outreach programs. On the surface, Eddie Long appeared to embody the ideal pastor, compassionate, articulate, and deeply committed to his congregation. But beneath that public persona was a dark and disturbing reality. Long's rise to prominence began in the 1980s and 1990s. He was a gifted speaker, known for his ability to connect with young men and families struggling with challenges in their lives. He preached about discipline, success, and moral responsibility. Parents entrusted their teenagers to his guidance, confident that Long's mentorship would keep them on the path of righteousness. Young men were drawn to his messages of empowerment, redemption, and spiritual maturity. In many ways, his influence was profound and deeply personal, shaping the lives of countless individuals in his community. He built a reputation for transforming the hopeless into confident, successful members of society, and for many, his guidance felt life-changing. But the influence he wielded came with a sinister shadow. Behind closed doors, Eddie Long engaged in behavior that would later shock the nation. Several young men in his congregation came forward with allegations that Long had sexually abused them over a period of years. The victims, many of them teenagers at the time, claimed that he had used his spiritual authority to coerce, manipulate, and control them. He framed these acts as part of a religious or mentorship process, insisting that compliance was a test of faith or a pathway to spiritual growth. In reality, it was a calculated abuse of power. The allegations surfaced publicly in 2010 when 4 young men filed lawsuits against Long, accusing him of coercion, sexual misconduct, and emotional manipulation. The men alleged that Long had groomed them through church activities, private counseling sessions, and one-on-one mentorship, gradually crossing boundaries until they felt trapped by fear, shame, and the weight of his authority. They claimed that the pastor had used scripture, promises of divine blessing, and threats of spiritual punishment to ensure compliance. According to the victims, Long's behavior was not impulsive but systematic, exploiting his position as a spiritual leader to maintain secrecy and control. For years, the congregation had been unaware of these abuses. Many of Long's followers trusted him implicitly, believing that he was morally above reproach. Parents who had sent their children to his mentorship programs felt betrayed and horrified. The accusations tore at the fabric of a church that had been built on community, faith, and trust. The scandal was amplified by Long's public persona. He was a charismatic figure who had often spoken about the importance of integrity, discipline, and righteousness. To have such allegations leveled against him created a profound sense of cognitive dissonance within the community. People struggled to reconcile the man they had admired with the actions described in court filings. The legal proceedings were complex and emotionally charged. Attorneys representing the young men argued that Long had intentionally leveraged his spiritual authority to manipulate and exploit his victims, a pattern that spanned multiple years and affected multiple individuals. Defense attorneys for Long denied the allegations, suggesting that they were motivated by financial gain, jealousy, or misunderstanding. The case quickly became a media spectacle, with news outlets across the country covering the proceedings and highlighting the broader issues of abuse within religious institutions. Although Long denied wrongdoing throughout the legal process, the lawsuits were eventually settled out of court. The settlements, reportedly in the millions, brought financial resolution but no formal admission of guilt. For the victims, the settlements were bittersweet. They provided compensation and validation. Yet the emotional and spiritual damage inflicted over years could not be fully repaired. The church was left grappling with a crisis of leadership, credibility, and faith. Congregants faced the difficult task of separating the institution they valued from the man who had betrayed it, a challenge that would take years to navigate. The scandal prompted nationwide reflection on the accountability of religious leaders. Eddie Long's case became a cautionary tale, illustrating how spiritual authority can be abused when left unchecked. It highlighted vulnerabilities in mentorship programs, youth ministry, and church oversight, raising critical questions about how institutions can protect vulnerable individuals while maintaining their spiritual mission. Churches across the country began to implement policies aimed at preventing abuse, including mandatory reporting, training on appropriate boundaries, and independent oversight structures. The personal consequences for the victims were profound and enduring. Many experienced psychological trauma, difficulty trusting authority figures, and crises of faith. Some struggled with mental health challenges, including depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The betrayal cut deeply because it came from someone who had positioned himself as a guide, protector, and moral compass. The emotional weight of being deceived by a figure of faith was unlike any ordinary betrayal. It combined spiritual disillusionment with personal trauma, leaving scars that would last a lifetime. For the broader community, Eddie Long's case challenged perceptions of religious leadership, particularly in the context of megachurch culture. It raised uncomfortable questions about the balance between charisma, influence, and accountability. When a leader holds immense power, both spiritual and financial, what safeguards exist to prevent exploitation? Long's actions revealed the dangers of unchecked authority and underscored the need for transparency, oversight, and vigilance within religious organizations. Despite the scandal, some members of the church initially remained loyal to Long, citing his past contributions, sermons, and community initiatives. Others left immediately, unable to reconcile his public persona with the private allegations. The church itself faced the challenge of rebuilding its reputation, restoring trust, and implementing reforms to prevent future abuses. The leadership had to confront systemic failures, both in policies and in culture, that had allowed misconduct to go undetected for years. Eddie Long's story also prompted broader conversations about power dynamics within religious institutions. His ability to manipulate, coerce, and control young men under the guise of spiritual mentorship highlighted a pattern of abuse that is not unique to one individual but is seen in various contexts where trust and authority are concentrated in a single figure. Scholars, advocates, and journalists have used the case as an example to illustrate how institutions can inadvertently create environments that protect perpetrators while silencing victims. Ultimately, the legacy of Eddie Long is one of betrayal, exploitation, and caution. He promised guidance, protection, and spiritual growth, yet he violated the very principles he claimed to uphold. The victims endured years of manipulation, coercion, and abuse, and the community faced the painful realization that trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. Long's story serves as a stark reminder that authority, even when cloaked in faith, can be misused with devastating consequences. It compels religious institutions, congregants, and society at large to remain vigilant, demanding accountability, transparency, and ethical conduct from those who hold positions of spiritual power. For those who followed Eddie Long, the damage extended beyond finances or physical safety. It was a spiritual and emotional betrayal that left lasting wounds, a lesson in the fragility of trust when placed in the hands of those who misuse it. His actions created ripples that affected not just the direct victims, but entire communities, families, and institutions. The haunting truth remains: the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most righteous, most compassionate, and most devoted to their cause. Eddie Long's story is not merely a cautionary tale about one man. It is a study in how unchecked power, charisma, and authority can become tools for exploitation. It illustrates how blind faith can be weaponized, how devotion can be manipulated, and how trust can be shattered in ways that echo far beyond the individual victims. The story forces reflection on the responsibilities of leadership, the vigilance required to protect the vulnerable, and the moral imperative to confront betrayal, no matter how beloved the figure may appear. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.